I'm a second year PhD student at Brighton, and I decided to take part in the ARENA programme as a way to think around some of the different methodologies, different approaches to take to the research that I'm doing as part of the PhD. And with the Yve Lomax class today, we had various chapters that we needed to read before we came. And it wasn't until I'd read all 4 of them that I realised that I understood more than I did at the beginning about this idea of using language as a way to think through things, which I think is what she does very well. So I was excited to come today and hear her talk through some of these ideas. I think she's highlighted a whole different way of thinking about the research. I'm a writer myself. I've done a very different kind of writing, and it's encouraged me to think about writing as part of the process of research, and not to try and limit myself to an academic form of writing, or to really experiment, and that it's part of the creativity and the making of knowledge in the research process. It's very rare to meet someone like Yve, I think. She's a very special kind of academic in that way, because a lot of them are they might have wonderful ideas, but they follow a particular path in terms of putting together a research project, or there's a format, there's an academic format, but she's completely unconventional and suggests trying something completely different and seeing what happens in the process, and not being scared to do that the risk-taking is part of it. Just allowing yourself to try things out and think as you write, and see what comes from that. I think she used rap theory. I think it was the rhythmical sense of rap that she was interested in, the idea of patterns of sound and different levels and tones in what you write. It's nice to be able to have the space to meet with other researchers, and we all come from very different places in terms of our thinking, and it's great to have the chance just to share ideas and be surprised as well. You have to come open, I think, to these classes, and you'll gain a lot.
I'm studying at Royal Holloway, and I'm here today because I'm writing a PhD in landscape and theatre, so I'm interdisciplinary and I have to use different modes and styles of writing too. What I want from Yve and what I'm learning is about how to write about creative practice and how not to lose that creativity, so to actually look at the practice of writing itself and the way that we're representing the art that we're writing about. So not just how you write or what you're writing, but yes, the art of writing.
Okay, fantastic. And from the discussions that you've already had, what kind of areas do you think will be useful for me to go in deeper with her?
I think probably her representation of images and how we look at the way that we recognise things and the effect that recognition has on something, and just to not to take something as a presupposition, not to take something as given, but to look at the way that we're constructing how we think about images and photography, and for me particularly with the image of theatre. I think we're all very much looking forward to seeing her present her spoken work, because one of the hardest things as a theatre academic or in any discipline is to transfer what you've written to a paper, and the way to actually write in a way that makes that you're able to present it to people and for it to read in a spoken format. And I think her background in rap is going to prove very interesting for that. So I imagine it will be similar to some performance poetry, but that's very exciting for an academic text.
Hi, my name is Aijan. I'm a student at the University of Brighton, and I'm currently doing my second year in my PhD, which is on the topic of art interventions in public spaces. And I'm doing my field work specifically in North Cyprus. Yve Lomax is giving us a masterclass. And what was interesting was that, in contrast to the previous masterclass that we had, that Yve Lomax is actually an artist herself. And as someone who is both doing research as an artist and also as a researcher, it was very interesting to see how she tackled the textual side of art, and how she took certain concepts and expressed herself through the writing as opposed to doing it through her art. So that was quite interesting. I wanted to see how she would do that. And it's very different from reading other theoretical works, such as the previous masterclass. The reading that we had for that one differs immensely from what Yve Lomax has written. And it's a bit comforting also to see that there are a lot more creative ways that you can express certain concepts and ideas that you have. And I think one of the other interesting things is that you can be given a text and read that beforehand, but you develop your own understanding of it, and then when you actually attend the masterclass and you have this whole other explanation of the text and of the ideas by the person who's actually written it, you do tend to doubt your understanding of what you have read and what you've understood from it. But then again, it's a bit like art in that sense as well, is that one person's explanation and understanding differs from, you know, the other person who's reading it. It's quite subjective in that sense, which is something that I'm going to be tackling with when I actually write my thesis. It would be interesting when the discussion actually starts to see how all those different understandings collide, I guess.
Someone once said that it's important that you invent your own questions. This someone who once said was a wonderful reader, not only of philosophical writings, but more, much more besides, and how he wrote. His prénom was Gilles, and he did indeed say that if you aren't allowed, I quote, to invent your questions with elements from all over the place, if people pose them to you, you haven't much to say. Inventing a question, you are probing. You are testing out what you can say, what can be said, what can be seen, what can be done. And this is much more than merely reacting. It's much more than saying, what's wrong with you? Inventing a question, you're constructing a problem. Before finding a solution, you construct a problem, and making such a construction, you are not taking things as given. And this can include what is called yourself. Inventing a question, you are constructing a problem. Call it problematization. Michel Foucault, he never called himself a philosopher, said problematization beautifully, I quote, "Far from being the still, incomplete and blurred image of an idea that eternally retains our answers in some upper region, the problem lies in the idea itself. The idea exists only in the form of a problem, a distinctive plurality whose obscurity is nevertheless insistent and in which the question ceaselessly stirs. What is the answer to the question? The problem. How is the problem solved? By displacing the question." Now, in problematizing, you are not taking something for given. For example, as Foucault shows, psychiatry in the 19th century recognized a discrepancy between what could be seen and what could be said as madness, and accordingly came to actively problematize the notion of madness. Problematizing. Can I do that? In writing, with writing, can I do that? Ask yourself. When you construct a problem, you are not taking things as given. For a moment, psychiatry didn't take what is named madness as given. It problematized the name madness, and it problematized the named madness. In constructing a problem for writing, you are not taking a style, a modality, or a form as given. You are inventing a problem for it. And in a recently published body of writing, a problem appeared as a figure suddenly appears in a doorway and says for all to hear, "This voice is not mine." Yes, a figure appears and says, "This voice is not mine." Writer, reader, and audience are not sure what to make of this, and even so, more so when the sound of the words subsides, a left hand shoots out only to come back and slap itself against the uttering mouth. The figure appears and there is no announcement of a proper name, but a personal pronoun is said. It is he. What idea comes with this figure? At the moment, it is an idea that exists only in the form of a problem, an obscure figure is before me. Yet the obscurity is nevertheless insistent, and it insists for nearly a whole book. And in the end, the very pronoun he will come to exist in the form of a problem. In one way or another, examples of figures have always appeared in my writing. They've enabled me to say something I've found difficult to say. They have enabled me to find ways to invent my own questions, to bring about events and new combinations of matters. So, for example, in writing The Image, published in 2000, the figure of a Sagittarian enabled me to find a way to write of the multiplicity that pertains to time. Now, the Sagittarian took me to Sagitta, which took me to the image of time as an arrow, which enabled me to find a way into the philosophical work of Henri Bergson, who asserted that time can never be stopped or frozen, which has had consequences for how time and the photographic image have been brought together and understood. Now, a figure that appears in early writings is the fabulous feminine. Now, this figure makes her appearance in a text called A Metaphorical Journey. And she appears as she, of whom so much has been spoken of, or in other words, fabulated. For long enough, the fabulous feminine had been spotlighted as the figure that makes all the difference between the figurative and the literal. Yes, we've heard it all before. The figurative, metaphors, tropes, there's a turning away from, a deviation from the literal path. Indeed, with the figurative, something is missing. Something is absent, is not in its proper home, is away on a metaphorical journey. And what else is this but that which is most proper to literal meaning? However, the figure of the fabulous feminine enabled me to see how the absence that she figures provides the means for the literal to return and present itself as the most proper. I'll put it like this. Through a game of absence and presence, the figurative comes to provide the means to an end. Now, in the writings of Michel Serres, which have been more ways than one crucial to my writings, you can find a host of figures. Now, Michel Serres is a philosopher of science, and what matters to him is relations, translations, rapport. To explicate a treatise in physics, Serres will bring into play a figure from myth to a baker folding dough. And to move between the humanities and the sciences, the separation between he abhors, Serres will rely on a figure to make the passage. And he says the god Hermes converted him to it. Rapport, not division. There is indeed Hermes, the messenger that enables Serres to move back and forth between domains. There is also the parasite, the hermaphrodite, the harlequin, and the angel, to name but a few. And speaking on mathematics in an interview with Bruno Latour some years ago, Michel Serres says, every time Plato had something difficult to say, he abandoned the technical vocabulary and goes to myth, telling a story that globalizes his point ever more. He is always in the process of moving about obliquely. Where neither mathematics nor logic can go, let myth go. Figures never underestimate what they can do. So, the figure standing in a doorway who has said, "This voice is not mine," makes an appearance in my most current book, which has the title Pure Means, Writing Photographs and an Insurrection of Being. And this body of writing starts with a pressing necessity. To write after a previous work ends with dividing the division that separates and produces the non-linguistic. Indeed, at the end of this body of writing, called Passionate Being, Language, Singularity and Perseverance, a disturbance is produced within the division between humanitas and animalitas, between human and animal, that is based upon having and not having the word, and which consolidates a division between the linguistic and the non-linguistic. It is with this disturbance that Pure Means begins. Yet it's quickly acknowledged that the issue of division between humanity and animality has not disappeared. The disturbance, however, makes addressing it ever more present. ever more pressing. Excuse me. Necessity is pressing, and it's pressing hard. And it's not long before the figure in the doorway first shows up as a possible example of what makes a gesture. So the figure stands in the doorway and speaks, and then as the words cease making a sound, their left hand shoots out, only to come back and slap itself against the uttering mouth. At this point, everyone in the room stops what they're doing and turn their heads to stare. For some, it is the words that are shocking. For others, it's that slapping action of mouth, of hand against mouth. And what happens next is the stranger, and he is a stranger to those present in the room, sees actions interrupted. He sees the words of Walter Benjamin come alive. Quote, "The more actions are interrupted, the more gestures we obtain. As actions are interrupted and heads are turned to look, the figure sees nothing other than a room full of gestures." Can you see it? Interrupted actions are showing gestures, and what is to be seen and experienced here is movement in the midst of its taking place, and as such having no reference to a directing force or power that remains external to it. And to see this exhibition is to have, if only briefly, a vision of an activity or movement that is not aimed at an end or an output, and which makes means mean the management, manipulation, putting to work of bundles of relations, so there is productivity that goes hand in hand with accountability. And now I can say that the insistence that the obscure figure in the doorway brought a problematization that demanded I find out what pure means can be. Now, to say pure means frees the word, means, from its usual discursive constraint. An awkward perspective is introduced, and with that, a certain use is deactivated. And with this deactivation, an opening for a new possibility takes place. And with it, language has a chance to show itself as no means to an end. And for a moment, there is no division running through it. Yes, this is what pure means can be. A deactivation of, better still, a non-activation of separation and division. There is no making or cutting of a separate sphere, no division in the powers of being. Indeed, seeing what pure means can be became an eye-opener in seeing how governmentalization, operates through economy. That is to say, economy as the purely practical activity of organizing for a purpose, of making means to an end, and which goes back to oikonomia, you can hear economy in these words, the management of oikos, which is the household, and which cuts a division between a power to be and a power to act. I say governmentalization. And Michel Foucault said the word as he considered a power not sovereign and juridical, but of essentially governmental. With the governmentalization of being and living, urban space, architecture, agriculture, housing, slaughterhouses, hospitals, eating, the media, communication, and sex, there comes, in the words of Giorgio Agamben, the triumph of oikonomia, the triumph of management. Ask yourself, what in my life and living is not managed, steered, and governed? Ask yourself. So let's return to that figure in the doorway. Who said this voice is not mine, and then had a left hand shoot out only to come back and slap itself against the uttering mouth. And pure means I ask, would it be wrong to connect what was said with what was seen? And I answer, for sure. A connection almost forces itself upon you once individual biography becomes the pivotal consideration. Albeit an exaggerated gesture, he is gagging himself after omitting something he shouldn't have. Yet, this connection that relies upon, if not promotes, individual biography, which makes voice, thoughts, and deeds done a personal possession, is scuppered by the very utterance of, this voice is not mine. The assertion immediately makes the question of having a voice become undone. What is more, hearing the words, "this voice is not mine," is not merely a negation, but rather a de-attribution that makes inoperativity come to the voice that for so long has worked to be in the service of a soul communicating itself. The voice. I've heard of a book that was never written. The author of this book, the author who never penned a word of it and who makes saying author a conundrum, says the title of this stubbornly unwritten work is The Human Voice. George Agamben did not write the book, yet, although it did not happen, he gives the question that would form its inquiry. Is there a human voice, a voice that is the voice of a man, as is the chirp is the voice of a cricket, or the bray the voice of a donkey? And if it exists, is this voice language? Is language the voice of so-called human beings? Perhaps they have no voice. For sure, human beings have a soundbox. I'm using it. A phonic apparatus. It is something that humans share with animals, monkeys, birds, cats and horses, and I'm not sure about ants and snails. But according to the metaphysics that in many ways still rules the Western day, what constitutes human speech, so-called meaningful discourse or logos, is the removal of the animal voice. So it goes. Man is the animal endowed with speech. And as soon as he speaks, there's the sound of an animal in flight. There is, I quote, only the trace of the animal's voice's absence of its death. And here is drawn a division between phone and logos, voice and language, not having the word and having the word. A division is made, and then comes human and animal. And with this there will come a division between the human and the non-human, and the inhuman and the less than human. And with this division will cut through my living being. It will cut through your living being. It will cut through my body, your body. It will divide and separate. It will bring hatred between bodies of being, bodies of so-called human beings. George Agamben did not write his book on the human voice. It did not happen. Yet he asserts that what calls itself man is always the place and at the same time the result of ceaseless divisions. And it is urgent to work on these divisions. And I'll add, to find out what non-division could be. Right up the very last pages of Pure Means, the figure stands in the doorway and continues not to say another word. Yes, it's the last page of the book, and it has been written, I quote. He is still standing there and still not uttered a word since saying, "This voice is not mine." A voice had spoken as unpossessed and unattributable, and at that moment a displacement was introduced into the world. He no longer stands as the man that speaks for the human in general. He has not uttered a word, and a remarkable patience, conviction, fidelity, or love still has his hand clamped over his mouth. For some, he would appear to be depriving himself of the one thing that makes him human, language and the voice that has had the cry or chirrup of the animal banished from it. But for him, there is this no deprivation at all, none whatsoever. However, there is deactivation of a division that separates along the lines of having or not having language. There is the activation of non-division. This is what pure means can be, a deactivation of separation and division. Having uttered the words non-division, let me now give extracts from a recently written work that goes by these very words and continues a concern with what a figure can do, be it singular or plural. The text begins with the assertion, "They divided the world." It then goes on to say, "They never stopped dividing the world. The separations are still coming." And then, here comes this, and here comes that, as the operation of division. They call it knowledge. And here comes this as divided from that. And here comes the separation that excludes and perhaps abandons. This is a figure for division and separation. They is a figure for division and separation. For they is produced by division with which immediately comes us and them. But they are not my enemies. They are that which in each and every one of us divides and separates. For the sake of knowledge, management and identity, for the sake of the self, the family, the nation, or indeed so-called mankind in general. But then, in the very midst of they, comes a figure that is barely on the threshold of appearing. This figure long ago ceased to behold they as separate. This figure never did quite fall the division that has had being us as divided from them. Now this figure is in no way other to they, but in the midst of they it does come as an obscurity. It is an idea that exists only in the form of a problem, better still, and a distinctive plurality whose obscurity is nevertheless insistent, and in which the question ceaselessly stirs. This figure is no character that walks the earth, dressed in red or purple, but it is as the movement of light and shadows in the trees. And the figure can be expanded. Now it is a landscape. And here is the idea existing only in the form of a problem is most certainly a distinctive plurality. From the close-by grass and trees to the most distant folds of land, each detail, I quote, stands erect in its own validity. And what needs to be added here is an observer. So here is a landscape, and I am an observer within it. And it is precisely at this point that the problem stirs and becomes insistent. My looking, my division cuts no separation, no division. Put it like this, I quote, details are no longer part of a grouping in a picture of which I am the focal point. The focal point is everywhere. Nothing has reference to me, the looker. I'm quoting here from Nan Shepherd's short, beautiful little book called The Living Mountain. So details are no longer part of a grouping in a picture of which I am the focal point and which, as that, separates me from what is seen. And with a separation not taking place, I take a leap. And I say that the landscape figure is an event. And then I say what there is to apprehend with this event is a taking place as not the administration of good sense. What there is to apprehend is the event of taking place of as not. The administration of good sense is concerned with division and characterization, as it seeks to grade, sort, and organize similarities, the alike and the least similar, the greatest and the smallest, and hence establish equivalences and separations. But what comes with that obscure figure, that is also an idea existing as a problem, that is also a landscape, that is also an event, is a taking place as not the instituting of division. As not division. But let's hesitate before rushing to say the word continuum. Now, as not strikes a line through division. As not divides it. And in this instant, division isn't confronted with something external to it. On the contrary, division is set in relationship to itself, which is to say that division meets itself. It's a self-relation rather than a relation of a force to another force. So an internal tension turns and something hard to pin takes place. So let's look at that. Let's look at a division that once and time again brings the citizen and the non-citizen. I look, but immediately as not beckons my attention, and nothing in me wants to look away as I see as not bring a new division that divides the division between the citizen and the non-citizen. So this second division is not the same as the first, but is not external to it. It is, again, division set in relation to itself. As not strikes through the division, it divides the division, And what comes is the non-citizen. I repeat, the non-citizen. As the division is divided, as not introduces an obscurity into this partition that produces the citizen and the non-citizen. So the division between the citizen and the non-citizen ceases to be clear and straightforward. So things become complex, as on both sides there is this curious continuity that cannot be defined either as citizen or non-citizen, but yet doesn't offer another identity. The non-citizen, or in other words, non-division. So the writing and thinking taking place under the heading of non-division brings a figure that is the event of as not. And what is key here, and here I'm entangled in lines of thought from Michel Foucault to Agambin's wonderful commentary on the letters of St. Paul to the Romans in the book called The Time That Remains, is what I'm entangled with these lines concerned with the operation of division. The force of division is not turned back towards another force. Division is turned towards itself. As Michel Foucault would put it, a force is bending back upon itself. And such division, with this division is set in relationship to itself, and as not, inoperativity comes to it. And this inoperativity, this deactivation, I'm calling non-division. And it has taken me a while to come to this very understanding. Indeed, the figure called as not has enabled me to better understand non-division, as it calls into question the artifice of division. Ask yourself, what in my life does not undergo the operation of division that separates, partitions, and estranges? Isn't this the condition that we call personal time? So much division for the sake of identity and identification, knowledge and management. Worldly relations are nigh on everywhere cut through with division, separation and partitions. And division bolsters, you will know this already, if not produces, propriety, possession, ownership and hostility. And then I'm confronted with the idea that I saw coming. The figure calling as not is calling for a vocation. Yes, a vocation, a manner of acting upon and experiencing what is present. And then I say, I live division and the effects of propriety, possession and ownership and hostility every day. But at this very moment, there is nothing in me that wants to deny or ridicule the calling that has come, which is the calling of as not. The calling of as not. The moment, along with myself, has been seized. And that is to say that division and the worldly condition that it brings or bolsters have been set in relation to themselves. Indeed, with the calling of not as not comes a profound questioning of having, which includes the having of myself. And so I say, with confidence, perhaps a leap of faith, I can say that the figure that appeared barely on the threshold of appearing in the midst of they is a figure of deactivation of division, that happens through the use of and the calling of as not. This figure of as not is not formed from similitude. It never will have similitude at its disposal. It will never form a figuration that is as if. Indeed, with this figure, we do not have a figure of speech that is speaking of something as if something else, and as such, but affirming the good sense of the division that separates and produces the literal and the non-literal. What this figure does is to set this very division in relation to itself. The figure as not divides the division between the literal and the non-literal. And what comes here is the non-literal, and I'm not weeping. With this very figure, this figure of as not division that bears little resemblance to any other figure that walks the earth, struts the stage, or moves swiftly through the pages of a book, this figure that is at once an idea that exists in the form of a problem an event and a landscape of non-division, there appears that which cannot quite be defined as either the literal or the non-literal, but as yet is not another identity. And here, good sense shudders. And now 4 paragraphs that will bring these words to an end. With the calling of as not, figuration is seized, and so also is time. This is the moment when your heart is near to breaking. It is an intensification of time, better still a contraction. Something happens to time. To be precise, something happens to chronological time, that is, the time that passes and by which past, present and future life and living is measured. The calling of as not seizes chronological time, and what takes place is the immeasurable time of deactivation. The time of deactivation is the time it takes for a fulfillment of non-division, which is when division is as nothing. Let's not be shy in saying that the time of deactivation is the time in which reparation, redemption, healing comes. And some would call this messianic time. The calling of as not seizes chronological time, and there comes a contraction of the time that passes. Perhaps seems that past, present and future have been brought to a standstill, but this is not the case at all. For what is taking place is a drawing in that is akin to a muscle just before a leap is made. This is chronos, chronological time, contracted, and this is precisely the time when a chance comes to grasp time in a state of potentiality. Experiencing time in a state of potentiality, I cease being an impotent spectator watching the chronological time of my life passing by without any time left. The time of deactivation gives us a chance to experience the time that we ourselves are, and this is also a chance to grasp the potentiality of our worldly conditions and current situations. Grasping this potentiality is always an experience, for with it I can apprehend what I have been unable to be.
The as if and the as not, maybe there's something in that relationship to tease out or to.
I think it's something recently, and maybe you guys here probably would. I don't know if you might be involved in poetics. A difference between similitude and analogy, and I've been having this discussion quite a lot about when something is as if, when something is as. And a friend of mine answered the question by, as if is formed by taking that the world already has fixed identities, and as is saying it does not, right? Because in a sense, as is a process where, in a sense, what I did with this, and I know it's quite tough going, what I wanted to do was take a figure that could move between a landscape, become a landscape, right? We don't often think of a figure as a landscape. That could be an event. Well, a figure can be an event, right? But also it was hard to pin down whether it's singular or it's plural. Well, that kind of offends us, right? Because we think of the figure, we very quickly think of a figure as a human figure. So here already we had something that this figure was allowing as to happen, right? So it wasn't as the figure was as if a landscape, as if, like. It was as, right? And I think at the very end of, going back to the text, I don't think it's in this, but the very end, actually I think it is, at the very end of the extracts I gave you for passionate being, there's a whole section on as. There's this very fragile interval, right, where here I'm talking about where being, where the language, the world was in being, language. Sorry, I'm not answering that very clearly.
Very long day.
I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the aspect of performance. So what the experience is like for you, the connection between writing and performance, and how it might or might not activate different experiences of your thinking in relation to writing?
It's been very important, I think. I think it's been very important to give performances of my written work, and it happened quite quickly in my writing, as I said before, as a way to, the spoken word and the written word, there was a kind of, the rhythm of it was very, to hear it within the writing was kind of really, really important, particularly for my writing. So it was crucial, and I think it's kind of something of being that public event too, which I think of, which reading, you can have a reading group, yeah, but it never quite works the same. You know what I mean? We're having, you know, you'll sit around and you read a text, right? When you have a public event like this, right, and you'll share the text and you can talk about the text, it's actually quite different because you also have all those other factors involved, which is like the timbre of the voice, the way things are said, so on and so forth, who actually deeply affects what you're, as anybody in theatre knows, deeply affects what actually is being said, right? So yes, it's very, I don't know if I've adequately answered that, but it's probably best not to do it sort of 2 o'clock on an afternoon when you spent a whole morning talking, because actually your voice starts to, you know, pack up. But it really is about using your voice as well. I suppose one becomes for a moment, one actually acts. One has to act and use a voice.
I'm interested, if you're happy to, how that relates to what you were talking earlier about rap, and about particularly, I mean, I'm not certainly not an expert, particularly the way that rap is written to be spoken.
Yeah.
And that's something that's very interesting because I was struck watching you. I've seen, I recently saw Patience Agbali do her Chaucer's tale as performance poems, which is, she's written in the idea of a grime mix, and then sort of contrast that with Sharon Morris and her For the Oak, which is sort of set to music and images. Yeah. And this struck me in a very good way. This struck me as something different in the sense of what you've just done then reminded me of when novelists read out their work. And that was how you've done that. You've presented an academic paper. You haven't changed it performance. You're reading what you've written it for speaking. And I think that's really interesting because sometimes you hear people say, oh, I saw someone give a paper, and it's like they just read their paper out. And that's always said negatively. And so I just really enjoyed sitting here and listening to you read your paper out because you clearly wrote that for speech. But I think I could also read it. And
yes, you
could
could
come
read
that way.
it.
And so that I'm interested in the dual purpose there.
Yeah. Yeah, there are some bits of my texts I don't think I would ever read out. I don't think I can actually get them out, right? Because they're just like, they're prose, and that's what I want them to be. But there are that I actually do take. I'm very careful. When I know that I'm going to do a spoken performance, I go through the texts, and I keep my fingers crossed that it's going to work, but I will take out extracts that I feel are the most audible, right? The most soundful. Right, and I also, but the same time as that, and I really do hope you could carry the sense of quite difficult ideas about dividing the division and as not, right, with it as well. So I've got several things I have there to keep in mind as the sound of it. In fact, I can actually say it right there. I have to make sure I haven't got one of those long sentences that I'm going to trip up over all the place, right? But equally, there's the kind of the content, the sense of something that you don't, as a listener, don't become lost in what I'm trying to say. And I know sometimes you can try and say too much, and it's always better to say a little less, right? Because it's like watching the movies, you know, in fact, actually it's you that fill in all the gaps in modern filmmaking. There's this cut, but actually you fill in all those bits and you hook it up. Right, so actually what you're given is very little. In a lot, you know, modern action movie, there isn't much there that you make it up. So people, you need the time to hear what you're saying and take it to go with you in the saying of it. And that's the other thing, is that you can rush along too fast. And I know that people often that read out, it happens with students at college, they read out a paper and it's 100 miles an hour, and it's like, whoa, why are you doing that for? Because nobody can hear you. You know, it's like, it's pointless. Just give me a paragraph, right? At least we can talk about it. Yeah. So it's considered. It's considered for what I want to do with it. So.
And how, biographically speaking, how did you come to
be involved in rap, or do you look at it?
So I'm just wondering where you've gone from art school, and then now we're talking about photography
No, I think
and
it was
more
just coincidence.
philosophy. Okay.
Yeah, I was talking to Christine earlier. I'd actually finished my dissertation at the Royal College, right, and it was a real kind of breakthrough with certain sets of ideas that I was dealing with. And I actually found I was really enjoyed writing, thinking, even though I found it really, really difficult, but something happened there. And at the same time, actually, there was rap music was being heard a lot, yeah. And I was making some work, and I wanted to have this text piece with it, and I started, and suddenly I could feel the rhythm of it. So I continued to write it like that. And then the next piece of other writing I did, I just kept that going, yeah, that kind of rhythm, and I kept writing like that. And that was really important. So rhythm was, isn't it the old meaning of the word rhetoric? It's the beat that used to be when people gave public speeches, there was somebody beating in the background. That was the, you know it better than I do, yeah? The stick that would beat the time. And that was the rhetoric, I can't say it, anyway. That person was called the rhetoric person, yeah? So rhetoric kind of, I think, is deeply tied up with rhythm, isn't it? Yeah? Even though it's got bad press, and it needs to be a bad press with the politicians we have at the moment, who are nothing but rhetoric in the bad sense of the term. But I think what you do whenever we write, in a really strong sense of the word, rhetoric is involved. Right, and that's how we write, the rhythm of our writing, and everything else.
Writing existed as scriptura continua, there were no gaps between words, so it was just like a long list of letters. And then anyone that had been educated to be able to speak and engage in this rhetoric would know where those pauses were. And so by knowing the rules of grammar and syntax, you were able to articulate. I think it was the Irish scribes, when Irish scribes were transcribing a biblical scripture, and in order to make that more accessible to people as a readerly text, they started to kind of insert the gaps between the words, and then they invented punctuation as a way of marking the kind of pauses in the kind of hierarchy of the sentence. And so what I think is really interesting there is that relation between rhythm and the syntax as a kind of, I suppose, a kind of rule base for how the thinking is tends to get put together. And then what and then the act of writing. And so when you're talking about, rhythm, being kind of intrinsic to this kind of writing and rap, it's also kind of intrinsic to the way the thinking is kind of perpetuated, going back to that earlier thing. And I'm really enjoying that question, and also the idea of, that there might be certain kinds of thinking that are thought with others. So that might be the kind of writing that is more audible. And then there's other kind of thinking, maybe that, I don't know, it takes place in a different kind of composition, to use your term. So.
No, that was wonderful. Thank you, Christine. Fantastic.
The second half was pretty much just discussions on what had happened in the first part of the talk, and a lot of people were talking about some of the issues that they had with the template and the format of academic writing versus creative writing, and maybe bringing the two together. A lot was said, and it was a lot of material to take in one go, so it's just a matter of just going back and actually nitpicking through all that information to see what can be useful to me. It can be a bit terrifying when you see people nodding, agreeing with what Yve Lomax was saying, because you think, oh, everyone gets it, I don't know if I completely get it. But she did go on to end on a positive and encouraging note, saying that you need to understand the material for yourself in the way that you would understand it, not in the way that someone else understands it. So it's just a matter of allowing yourself to experience the text, and I think just let yourself become one with it and understand it in the way that you feel comfortable with. And there was another interesting point said about things being lost in translation when taking notes and then transferring it onto using it as material for your thesis. And then what's interesting is that I'm working in a bilingual environment, so there's a situation of things being lost in translation in addition to things being lost in transition when going from note format to thesis format. So that's something I'm going to have to pay attention to and see how I feel about that when I'm doing my final writing.
It's been very helpful in terms of how I'm going to write creatively in my thesis, because what Yve was saying is that you should actually set the terms for your own PhD, and you should set how you want the writing to be. And so I think she said, I'm trying to remember her exact words, but I think she said what you're trying to explicate, what you're trying to look at and observe should actually be implicated in your writing and the style of writing. I would like to explore passionate being, because it looks at the way that we use language and the way that it's evocative and sensuous.